In England, class had been based on titles granted by kings and queens. But of course, we didn't really have that in America, and so class is based on land ownership. One thing is true about America is it's much more socially mobile, meaning your opportunity to move up the ladder in class, assuming you're a white man, is much greater than it was in Europe. Let's talk about slaves and masters on plantations. Plantations developed in areas that could cultivate tobacco, and particularly this is going to be in the Chesapeake, which is the area around Virginia and Maryland. These are rough and small. Oftentimes they'd just be a clearing where some trees had been cut down and a very simple house had been built. Masters in the beginning tended to work side by side with their indentures and even for a little while with their slaves when that system took over. We're not talking about these gorgeous wrap-around porches with the columns. We're really talking about like a shed that you and 5 or 6 other guys could get out there and make. Death was everywhere. The chance of getting disease and dying suddenly was enormous. And it was also a boom and bust economy. There would be years where prices were high and planters would make a ton of money, but then there would be years where prices were extremely low, and no matter how much you grew, you couldn't make enough to keep yourself going. By the early 1700s, 3/4 of blacks were on plantations with 10 or more slaves. So most of the slaves lived on relatively large plantations. In fact, half of blacks lived on plantations with more than 50 slaves, which is a huge plantation, right? Blacks developed their own culture, particularly if they were on a plantation with other slaves, because then they had some privacy, and of course they had other Africans around them, African Americans around them. And we begin to see things like slave marriage develop. Now, slave marriage wasn't legally recognized, but of course the slaves would do it anyway. We also begin to see the African and Caribbean folk religions blending with Christianity to create a new type of religion, which I'll talk more about later in the semester. There were 2 types of slaves from the beginning: house slaves, who worked in the house. These were kind of maids and butlers and stuff, and field slaves. Masters having sex with their slaves was fairly common, particularly the house slave. If you were an attractive African-American woman, you were very likely going to be assigned to work in the house, and you were very likely to be subject to sexual advances from whatever whites were in the house, whether it be the master or his kids or whoever it was. There were quite a few mulatto kids, meaning half black, half white. Even if you were half white and you were born, your father was the richest man in the colonies, you were still black and you were still a slave. Nobody really cared that you were mixed race. There was a wide variety of how slaves were treated. Some were treated with great kindness, like they were members of the family, particularly on smaller plantations where they might kind of be part of the family. Others were treated brutally, like they were animals or even worse. And so there was an enormous difference in how slaves were treated from plantation to plantation. Now you can imagine some slaves didn't like this arrangement of being slaves, and so in 1739 a group of slaves rose up, seized weapons, and began massacring whites in South Carolina. This slave revolt is called the Stono Rebellion. About 100 slaves took part, and they were attempting to flee to Florida. Slavery was illegal in Spain, and Florida controlled Spain, so if they would have gotten to Florida, they would have gotten away. But they didn't get away. They were caught by a local militia and executed. Of course, most slaves participated in milder forms of resistance, things like being lazy, breaking your tools, injuring yourself on purpose so you didn't have to work. And of course, many slaves would attempt to run away, although the problem is there wasn't really anywhere to go unless you were close to the Florida border. Some slaves were skilled and were allowed to go work in the cities. For example, if you had a slave who knew how to be a blacksmith, you might let him go open up a blacksmith shop in the local city, say Charlestown, South Carolina. And he would be essentially independent, living on his own in his shop, but you would get the profits that he made working as a blacksmith. And so you did have these city slaves who enjoyed a high degree of autonomy or control over themselves. Talk about let's look at the North. Of course, there really weren't a lot of slaves in the North because of climate, because the North wasn't really suited to grow these cash crops like tobacco and sugar and indigo and things like this. The unit in the North wasn't a plantation, but the town. It was bound religiously. Everybody in the town theoretically shared the exact same religious beliefs. And religion, it was a theocracy. The leaders of the church were the leaders of the town government. And they would actually write a covenant where everybody agreed to believe the same thing religiously, And if you deviated from that, you were likely to be thrown out, as we talked about with Hooker and Williams and Hutchinson in the last chapter. If you look on your map here, you'll see that there's a meeting house in the middle of town, and that would be where all the government activities took place. They would choose selectmen, which is kind of a city council, and those were chosen by the adult male church members, and they would run the city. Usually the whole town would meet once a year and choose a selectman, and after that the selectmen would meet. Now you'll notice they live very close together. You see all these dots are houses, and you'll notice they're all kind of grouped around the center of town, and there's also a common field in the center of town. This is actually called the village green, and if you go up to places like Boston, it's called the green or the common. And if you go up to New England today, you'll still see a lot of major cities will still have their common intact. The Boston Common, in fact, is a really nice park in Boston these days. Now, the way this would work is you would have a small plot where your house was on, and you would live next door to all your neighbors, and then they would take all these outlying plots that don't have houses, and they would divide them up among all the people. And so you would work a farm that was right around your house, but then you would also go work fields that were far away from your house. The common, everybody would work it, and then that's how they would do things like fund government activities like schools. And so the common was a field that everybody used. Also, if you couldn't feed yourself, you could go ask to get food from the common, and you would probably be allowed to do that if, say, your husband was sick or something, and so you weren't able to bring in the crop. Let's see. You had to prove that you had been saved. Remember, this is predestination. So you had to prove that you had been saved to be allowed to be a full church member. And you did this basically by acting very religious. Some people have asked, if you believed in predestination, why behave? Well, because people had to believe that you had been pre-chosen by God, and you did that by acting super religious. The father divided up the land among all his sons, and he chose how he divided it up, but we are beginning to move away from the tradition of giving it all to the oldest and dividing it among all your sons. And since they tended to have lots and lots of kids during this period, that meant that even a fairly large landholding would be whittled down to very small landholdings over the generation. Often sons would live at home with their parents until their late 20s. Traditionally, when they would get married, that's when they would move out and get their own land. And as towns grew and estates split, they had to keep taking further and further land out so their kids could have land. And so eventually the towns began to bump into each other. And so sons would have to leave and go to unpopulated areas to create new towns because they were just simply running out of land. There were a lot of societal tensions in a society where everybody has to conform and everybody has to grant everything. Of course, not everybody really agrees on everything, so you have lots of fights and arguments. And one of the greatest example of these is the Salem witch trial in 1692, where in the town of Salem, they will accuse 19 mostly unmarried women of being witches, and they will eventually kill them. I'm not going to get too much into the details. Maybe I'll put a link up to a YouTube video about it or something. But a few things to understand here. First off, people literally believed in Satan and demons. They believed that people got possessed. And they believed specifically that these women were having sex with the devil. The other thing to understand about the Salem witch trials, it was kind of a war on women. Women were essentially the property of their husband. And so when you had a woman who did not have a father controlling her or a husband controlling her, and usually this would be a widow, somebody whose husband had died, that was a threat to the social order. A woman being successful on her own could possibly be an example for your wife. And if you mistreated her, she might start to think, hey, I can live on my own. And so when you had that widow who had that huge land holding out on the edge of town because her husband had died, she became a real problem to the Puritan worldview. And so it was not uncommon, not just in Salem in 1692, but generally in New England, that they might be accused of witchcraft and be hunted down and hung. Oh, so there's some pictures of the Salem witch trials. Like I said, I'll find a link to another video on it. And if you're interested in it, you can watch it. Finally, let's talk about cities. In 1770, the largest colonial city is Philadelphia with 28,000 citizens. New York has 25,000. The third biggest city is Boston at 16,000. Now, Philadelphia and New York were larger than every English city except for London. So these were large cities by the standards of the day. Today, New York has 19 million people, so the 25,000 people of 1700 New York doesn't seem like much, but at the time that was a big city. Charlestown was the largest city in the South with 12,000. The city's primary function was as a port. We're growing all this stuff. We know that. We're cutting down trees. We're trading furs. Well, that has to get back to the old world. And so you have to get it on a boat. And that's what the city is for. You bring the stuff to the dock, load it on the boat, and it gets brought over. Consequently, it's the merchants who control the cities. The cities also have the best schools. We'll talk about education in a little bit. They have the highest culture. If you want to go see a play or something, you typically have to go to a city. But they're also, as they always are, centers for crime, vice, things like prostitution, pollution. There's actually a lot of traffic in the cities. This is horse and buggy traffic, so that's kind of fun. We'll also see the first American police and fire departments as the cities try to deal with problems of crime and fire in a world where everything is made out of wood. They're a hotbed of ideas. This is where intellectuals come together, get together in the local tavern you see there, and begin to talk about maybe the writings of John Locke, our religious differences. And so they become a place where intellectuals begin to really develop. Newspapers and books from Europe come into the cities, so again, really feeding that desire for knowledge. Taverns and coffee houses were the great centers of debate, and the cities will come to be the incubators for the American Revolution. As we get into the Revolutionary period, you'll see that almost all the big leaders of the Revolution and really all the movements that lead to the Revolution come in one way or another from a city, because that's where you can get together with other people and begin to bounce ideas off each other. All right.